Hello, my name is Igor Krupnik. I'm curator of Arctic Ethnology at the National Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian Institute. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and friend of many years, Dr. William Fitzhugh. Bill is very well known across the Arctic. He's the director of the Arctic Studies Center and a curator of archaeology. He also has produced 6 major exhibits covering various areas of the Arctic from Siberia to Canada, Alaska, and Greenland. And now this one, the Narwhals, that he's going to introduce to you. Please enjoy his tour and his insight in the story of the climate change, Narwhal, Inuit, and modern cultures. Thank you.
Hi, we're at the Natural History Museum at the entrance of the Narwhal exhibit, Narwhal Revealing an Arctic Legend. This is an exhibit that we've opened last summer, be on for a couple of years. And we're just going to make some highlights here, going to show you some of the, a brief introduction to the show. This is a map of the Arctic. It's a map that we're not used to seeing because it's from the top of the world looking down. And we see the area for the narwhals in this part, northern Greenland, Canada, and they come as far south as Hudson Bay in this area here. It's an amazing part of the world that very few people know anything about because hardly any people get there except the folks who live in Pond Inlet and some of the native communities which are in that area. So we've learned a lot from working with them as part of this project. You may be listening and hearing some of the sounds of the narwhal. We have some underwater recordings of the narwhal here. And I'll show you the animal. We have a beautiful sculpture of a narwhal that was made for us by a zoologist in Ottawa. He knows the animals very well, and he's a beautiful artist at the same time. So you can see that majestic creature with the tusk coming out of the left side of the probably left incisor. It's an amazing animal, and we're learning so much about it. One of the parts of the exhibit deals with the medieval stories of the narwhal, going back to the unicorn, the great beast of the medieval time period. That was inspired by narwhal tusks that were brought back by Vikings from Greenland to the Old World. So that's probably how the unicorn story got started. So here we have a little story about the evolutionary history of the narwhal. We know very little about it because when those animals die, they go to the bottom of the sea, and we hardly ever find their bones. But in this case, there's a Pliocene cetacean, a sea mammal that looks like it was part of the evolutionary history of Mongols, found from Virginia. Really interesting. So we know really very, very little about this animal from the ancient fossils. So one of the ways we are learning about the animal is from the studies that have been done by Martin Nguyen, who will talk about these things himself. But it's a tusk that is not for spearing animals or breaking holes in ice. It seems to be something that is has to do with the sensing the environment. There are nerves that come out to the outside of the tusk, as you see in this illustration. And they are bringing some kind of information to the narwhal, maybe to deal with ice patterns or temperatures or salinity. So this is really new research that's just being done. In addition, there's a lot of work being done to sequence the narwhal genome. And in the absence of fossils, we may be able to tell something about its history and the function of the tusk from the DNA. These are 2 examples of narwhals from our collection. One was loaned to us recently, the double-tusked narwhal, caught in Alaska, a fantastic animal. As you know, we tell about how the animal is, tusk is only in the males, really. But occasionally, rarely, females have tusks, and it's usually smaller. So the animal has no teeth in its mouth. It only has a tusk. It's kind of a surprising creature. Here we have one of our docents in the hall here, and your name is Katie. And Katie's been interviewing. Well, I shouldn't say interviewing. Katie's been interviewed by public folks who are coming in, and she's providing a lot of information to people about the narwhals, showing them that the tusk. Here we have the tusk and a wonderful sample of the skull. You can see the big tooth where the tusk goes in on the left-hand side of the skull. What else do you have, Katie?
We also have this timer to see how long you can hold your breath, because narwhals can hold their breath for about over 25 minutes. This doesn't really record 25 minutes. This records about 3 minutes, but you know, we don't want people to hold their breath for too long, so 3 minutes is a safer bet.
So they're diving down 1,000 feet sometimes to find their food, and it's totally dark down there. How do they do it? Do you know?
They mainly use echolocation, so you can't really see it based on like the skull, but they actually have a big mound of fat right here that they use to direct and receive different sounds that it is produced.
So that bounces off things and like ice or maybe other animals or fish that they're looking for and so on.
Yep, like fish, squid, other nice tasty things.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Here's a example of some of the information we learned from the Inuit. This is a story, a graphic story. It's from Inuit in Canada who have a story about the origins of narwhal, coming from an evil mother who goes hunting with her son who's blind, and she has not been nice to him, and so eventually he ties the harpoon around her waist, and the harpoon's a sea mammal and carries her into the sea. And as she's going down, her hair is braided up into something that looks like a narwhal tusk. And this is the story of how the narwhal was, the origin story for the narwhal, according to Inuit. And we have soapstone sculptures that the folks do, the Inuit people, and they sell to tourists and others. Over here is a little description of some of the pop culture aspects. Narwhals these days are becoming almost as fun as polar bears for a lot of the public. And we're seeing a lot of interest in our exhibit, and we're spreading, information. There's stuff going into the schools that shows the narwhal as a very happy creature. We know from a long time ago, from the medieval time, that the narwhal and the unicorn, its originator was supposed to be a peaceful animal that was always promoting peace among the beasts of the jungle and other places. So it's very appropriate that we have narwhals as a kind of a kid thing now. This is a sculpture that was done for us by Abraham Ungak Rubin. He's a Canadian artist, Inuit artist, and he's created this beautiful rendition of an Inukshuk, which is these sculptures that the Inuit do in the Arctic. This is a little bit more elaborate than most Inukshuks, but it shows you the animals, and it has a narwhal and lots of creatures coming out of this great sculpture. So Abraham was very kind to make this for us and give it to the museum. Here's a map that shows us the incredible developments that are starting to take place in the Arctic Ocean. All these red areas are either oil reserves or mining places and so on. So as the ice melts in the Arctic, it's possible for ships and industry to get involved. So this is something we're very concerned about. We have to do this in the right way, make sure that the Arctic isn't polluted, and that the animals who live there still are available for native people who need them for their food. Marianne Marcoux is a biologist in Canada who's helped us with the exhibit. We have a little video here that shows narwhals at sea, pictures taken from drones. And here's some hunters who are hunting at the edge of the ice. Yeah, so here's the narwhals taken, showing them. They're a very social animal. They love to be swimming together, and young and males and females together. I always imagine, what is it like to swim when you have an 8 or 10 foot pole coming out of your jaw? But they seem to do it very beautifully. The museum has collections that represent narwhals, including a harpoon. These are things from Greenland that were collected in the 1890s. The narwhal was an important part of not only for food, but for making tools and artifacts. And in this little straight one over here is actually a drinking straw made out of a narwhal tusk so that they would be able to drink fresh water off the surface of the ice. Very ingenious. Much of our information comes from the Inuit in Pond Inlet, which is a town in northern Baffin Island where they still hunt narwhals, and they know a lot about it. Martin's work has been focused in this town, and they're cooperating with us and gave us a lot of wonderful data, learned how to work very closely with the Inuit people for researching narwhal biology, and this is something that's really developed because the show could never have been done without the cooperation with the Inuit. As you see, it's kind of a barren landscape up there. There's not a whole lot growing more than 2 inches from the ground. But wonderful people, full of information, full of liveliness. So here we have a graph, a little animated graph that shows you the changes in the Arctic ice in the summertime, and you see the very reduction of that ice cover. Most of it is being pushed over to the Canadian Arctic side, and you see a graph here that charts the summer distribution of ice, and it's just on a big downward curve here as it goes to the modern day, and it's going to keep going that direction for quite a while. So this is one of the reasons we're interested in the narwhal, because it's representing an animal that has to live in the Arctic ice. With the disappearance of the Arctic ice, the future of the narwhal is in question. I think that they will certainly survive, but it's going to be changes in their habitat, changes in how we use the Arctic, how the Inuit use the Arctic. All of these kind of themes, climate, biology, cultural history, are all part of this exhibit. So we hope you can come to the museum and take a look at it. We'll be up for a couple of years. And also want to let you know that we have a book that we've prepared that documents the narwhal, all about its history and people and so on too. So thanks very much.
Okay, I'm trying to get my screen up here. There we go. So I'm trying to get my first slide to go.
Still, if you click on the bottom, go back a screen.
To which screen?
Click on that back arrow. Click on the arrow on the top there. Okay, now on the bottom right, do you see the thing that looks like a projector symbol? Very, very bottom right.
Yeah, it's kind of covered up.
Minus sign.
Is that it? Oh, resume show
On
now?
the left. On the left of the minus sign.
Where is the minus sign now? I don't see
Bottom
that.
bottom right.
Bottom right
Bottom
still?
right corner.
It's covered up by the by Diane. I can't see. Oh, here it is. Okay.
Okay, and then there's a symbol to the left of it.
Yeah. Oh, the television-like screen? I
Yeah.
see.
Yep.
There we go. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So yeah, you've heard some of this introduction to the show, and there will be a few slides probably I'll go through fairly quickly because we've covered some of it in the introduction. But this is a wonderful exhibit that started about 3 years ago with the planning, and we want to share, you know, as much as we can with everybody. It's an exhibit that talks about a lot of different things, including, you know, the changes in the Arctic and the animal and how people and landscape and animals are all interrelated. So the animal itself comes from the word, narwhal comes from the Norwegian word meaning corpse whale. But as we say here, it's much nicer, in Inuktitut, kilalugak, one that points to the sky. So this is a fantastic creature that Inuit have known for a very long time. Here's a map that shows, you know, where our Pond Inlet is, which is the town where we work closely with people, and you see the Inuit, who are the major hunters and people associated with the animal traditionally. And down in the lower right, the crest of the Nunavut of northern Canada. It's the new political entity, including all the Inuit area. And you may see, and maybe partly covered up, but on the right side of that is a narwhal. As we mentioned in the introduction, the history of the animal is obscure. We have to go back 4 million years before we find any related fossils. And you see this strange creature on the upper right is what we call a norluga. It's a hybrid between a beluga, which is the white whale, and the narwhal. And you see all these teeth, which the narwhal doesn't have in its mouth. So some of the evolutionary people think that, you know, hybridization is one way that the strange development of the narwhal might have taken place. It's a curious thing that the Inuit have used the Arctic resources and animals for thousands of years. Even back to 4,000 years ago, we find narwhal materials in archaeological sites. And you see here some arrows pointing at some narwhal material from Dorset sites in northern Labrador dating to 500 AD. So it was used, it was a very important animal for raw materials, resource food, skins, and others. And last summer, Derek Pottle, a good friend of mine from Rigolet, showed me a piece of narwhal that he got on the coast of Labrador, which is one of the southernmost areas that narwhals ever show up. And he's an artist and carves this material along with walrus tusks and other things. But the story of the animal goes back in Europe to the Vikings, who brought back narwhal tusks from Greenland starting around 1000 AD, probably inspiring the Middle Age stories of the unicorn and how this was a treasured, peaceful creature and whose horn tusk materials were used to make drinking cups that would be immune to poison. So very, very handy drinking cup for a king nervous about his rivals. And on the right side, you can only maybe see part of it. The narwhal tusk became part of a very famous throne in Denmark. All the uprights are narwhal tusks. So very, very important in the European mythology, as it has been also in the Inuit mythology for years and years. Gradually, naturalists coming back and explorers coming back brought images and ideas about this creature, some pretty outlandish ones, as you see on the right, or on the left, sorry. But gradually, over the centuries, they look more like a modern narwhal. And we have a great quote here from Martin Frobisher, who talks about seeing this animal having a horn wreathed like a taper or candle, and relating it to what he might think to be the sea unicorn. So some very early European descriptions from this area. We are very fortunate to have the loan of a wonderful double-tusked creature from caught off the Barrow, Alaska. Here you see, and the poor lonely female skull looking down at the bottom, wishing she had a tusk too, let alone a double tusk. So this is one of the centerpieces for the exhibit. And then we've already talked a little bit in the interview, so I won't talk much about this, but the Greenland and the Canadian Inuit, have hunted narwhals for 4,000 years or more, and they've developed intricate technology to do that. You see some of the examples, including an incredible model kayak with hunting gear all set up. These are from the Smithsonian collections. So they give a good context for the modern material, which are coming from these villages in northern Canada. I didn't put the Greenland villages on the slide, but Greenland, especially the east coast and west coast of Greenland, very important areas for narwhal habitat and hunting. Pond Inlet was the town that we worked with most closely and where Martin's research has been taking place largely. And you see some of the people here, Charlie Inarak, Inuki Inarak, and Natasha Simone who helped us a lot with information, and some of the old folks, now deceased, Cornelius Nutarak, wonderful Inuit elder who told Martin lots of stories about their beliefs about the animal. So we really had wonderful encouragement and participation, from that community. You see here a family gathered around eating muktuk or matak, pronounced differently in different places. This is the delicacy of the inner skin and outer blubber layer, which is so delicious and is eaten throughout the Arctic as one of the primary materials people really, they not only, of course, they use the meat and the blubber and the horn and ivory and so forth, but this is something that they just love. And it's kind of like the addiction that some northern people have to these bake apples, Rubus camimoris, that comes along in the summer as one of the wonderful berries. So the Inuit have been making art of the narwhal. We see here a photograph of a picture showing a lady drumming the narwhal ashore, trying to attract them to be, to get the animals to come to you. You have to be friendly with them, and you have to convince them that they want to give their bodies to the people. And then they send the spirits off to the upper world where they rejuvenate and come back to Earth again. So if you're really careful about how you hunt and the respect you give the animals, that you will ensure their continued availability for people. And then there's a modern carving in a rock that Martin had a photograph of, which is great, showing an Inuit dressed up in his winter clothing, carrying a narwhal tusk. So this emblem is really important for the northern people in Canada, especially for the Inuit are coming from the most northern regions, northern Ellesmere, northern Greenland. And you see here all the different uses to which they put these stories in drawings and sculpture. On the left, Abraham Rubin's beautiful carving of a narwhal tusk showing all the different animals, which you also saw in his Inukshuk, which is seen here. And he's got a very wonderful style of showing the interconnections of animals, people, symbols of the Canadian North. So we are very appreciative of his participation in the project. And then, of course, today we are seeing all this new stuff, all this wonderful publicity, wonderful, kind of fun material about the narwhals. They've kind of sort of stolen the show from the polar bears, who used to be the warm cuddlies of the North, now somewhat threatened by loss of habitat because of melting ice and so on. But there's all this wonderful stories. And in the upper right, one of my friends here at the museum sent me a note just last night, and he said, look at this. And his young daughter had bought a little stuffed narwhal from the museum and put diapers on it. So you can see how this idea is filtering into our, our consciousness in lots of different ways. Jewelry, carvings of narwhal materials seen here, sales of narwhal tusks can be very important for Inuit subsistence. They don't have a lot of means of making their own living in the North, and so hunting the animals in a judicious way and a sustainable way is really part of their life, and they produce beautiful materials with these things. So the final story really is this business of the shrinking Arctic ice you see in the diagram on the left. We're going to have a place in northern Ellesmere and Greenland, which is the last ice, the last area for summer polar ice. You can see the quick reduction over the years and how it's expected to end up around 30, 40, 50 years from now. So this is really an important development. It's one of the most important environmental changes the Earth has ever seen in many, many, many centuries. So the question is, how is this going to affect people? And we have James Simoni, who will be with us on the telephone later here, talking about how it's really difficult to say. And because the Inuit in this part of the world are going to be in the last area where there is a lot of summer ice. And so they may have, their habitat may be preserved for a long time, but if it gets much worse, if the ice disappears completely, we really don't know. But when an animal has evolved over many, many millions of years, as the narwhal has, there's got to be a reason for its survival. And so we don't expect that it's probably going to disappear, although the numbers may change a lot. So the warming story is another important part of the show. The Arctic is melting and warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. We have some of the impacts on the bottom here, changes in global changes, not just in the Arctic, and weather patterns, increased shipping, traffic, tourism, geopolitical issues, global sea level rise, altered food availability, and so forth. So, you know, we are entering a pretty uncharted time in the future, and all of these different elements are part of the exhibition. It shows some of those development areas we talked about earlier. The seismic issues are something that geologists use for prospecting for oil and minerals under the sea, and it's been found that that's very damaging to marine mammals and fish. And we're very fortunate that the Inuit of Canada have convinced their Supreme Court to create a resource, protected resource zone in this whole area. So their activism has been really important, and we expect that we need to find these, we need to be encouraging, you know, research and education and making people aware of these changes, how they're affecting people and animals, and then actually go out there and do things to make the changes that we need to have done. So that's my little slideshow here, and I appreciate your hanging in, and I'll be standing by to answer questions later on. Now I think we're going to have turn the show over to Martin.
So Bill, if you could press the stop share button, the big red button on the top.
I found it. I found it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Great. And then Meredith's got the next video.
Bill has co-curated this exhibit with Dr. Martin Uia, who is a dental surgeon and a dental scientist at the Harvard School of Dentistry. And Martin is a great person to work with because he got interested in narwhals because of this element of narwhal biology in narwhal tusk. Martin led several expeditions up to the Canadian Arctic and Greenland. He worked with native hunters, and he documented their stories and their knowledge about narwhals, as well as secured their assistance in studying narwhal biology. So this collaboration between an anthropologist and a dental scientist helped produce this magnificent exhibit that you're going to see.
Okay. Thank you, Igor. Thank you, Bill. And I certainly wanted to welcome all of you who have joined us today to help celebrate this wonderful animal and this incredible tusk. I've got one right behind me from a company, Bone Clones, that 3D prints these. And for the standpoint of being a dentist and someone who's interested in teeth, this is a world of fascination. And I think with all the ability to collaborate with Bill and the exhibits team, Marianne Marcoux from Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, this is a wonderful celebration of really an extraordinary animal. And we certainly thank you all for being a part of it. I'm going to get a little bit more into the biology of this animal for those of you that are interested. I'm going to see if I can get access to my slides. Does someone have to get out first before I do this? Because I have no access to...
You can just start screen sharing from the button in the bottom center.
Ah, okay. There we go. Good. So this is where I usually am found for a few weeks in the summer. We're in 36-degree water here. Most of the people that are in the water with me are either fisheries and oceans personnel or our Inuit collaborators. James Simony, who Bill had mentioned earlier, will be joining us. He might even be watching from a distance now, so welcome, James. And we look forward to having some participation with some questions where we can find some interesting truth about this animal. I was kind of curious when people were talking about the dive estimates for narwhal, because as was told and has been published, it's roughly 25 minutes. And I think most of the Inuit who have observed the narwhal would say it's quite a bit longer than that. But certainly they have been a great asset to collaboration and work and understanding of this animal. This is roughly the area that most of the work I do is in, and as Bill had mentioned, we're outside of Tremblay Sound, or outside of Pond Inlet, which is a little bit south on this map, and have worked in roughly 6 areas in the Canadian portion, in the northeastern part, and also in the northwestern high Arctic of Greenland. And this is a typical Jolly team that would be doing this every summer. Naturally, without the Inuit, we have a very difficult time both finding, getting access, and even understanding some of the habits and especially behavior of the whale, since that's really the most difficult part for us as biologists to piece together. And this is one of the most magnificent examples of teeth in the mammalian world. It defies really almost every principle and property of teeth I ever learned of as a dentist. Bill had talked about this as being primarily from the left side of males. Most females don't have a tooth, but about 10% published do present with a teeth, and some males don't have a tooth. And both sexes can have 2 teeth, although primarily those are males. So it has a very complete odd distribution. It is a tooth. It's nature's only straight tooth, nature's only spiraled tooth. It's nature's only consistently horizontally impacted tooth. It erupts through its lip. And interestingly enough, in the field of science, we're always hesitant to use words like only, the most. And this is one animal where we can feel quite comfortable using a lot of those superlatives. Bill had talked a little bit previously about some of the tapestries, both at the Paris Cluny Museum and at the Cloisters here in New York, and also alluding to the Inuit legend of the narwhal here. And to this day, when Bill had talked about the artwork with the woman with her hair spiraling, if Inuit see a narwhal with a school of beluga, as is sometimes seen, it is legend that that is the original woman. Now this is the evolution of teeth in toothed whales. If we get back to basics about whales, there are baleen whales and toothed whales broadly. And clearly there's one that doesn't fit the picture. And not only doesn't fit the picture, but literally can't fit the picture. In the sense if we do it to scale, we actually have to do the narwhal tusk to the side to graphically show it. And that's the narwhal mouth. Interestingly enough, it's a toothed whale. It eats fairly large fish, Greenland halibut, Arctic cod. So then the question becomes, well, how does it eat its food? How does it get its food? And there's a huge body of literature that shows the relationship between diet and tooth morphology, and it couldn't be more wrong in the narwhal. It's on every level counterintuitive, and naturally as a dentist, I found this fascinating. I thought, certainly there must be some secrets, there must be some evolutionary clues as to the purpose and function of teeth, and certainly the narwhal was kind of the example for me as the most extraordinary. Typically the kind of work I would do was anatomical specimen collection, originally with the Smithsonian. We've had a long, great collaboration with the museum, and they've done a terrific job in terms of capturing this animal and bringing it to a public forum and place where I think it so richly deserves. It's been such an elusive animal for so long, and to see it now be on the Nature's Mall, I think is a thrill, not only for those who study this whale, but for the Inuit communities who can see one of its representations being so aptly displayed here. This is the work I'm primarily doing more recently in the water with the whale, putting a tusk jacket on, as you see on the right side, and injecting solutions of high salt and fresh water, and then monitoring the physiologic response basically with heart monitors and brain activity. And it's hard to imagine if you've ever seen one of these tusks, but it is innervated in its full length. So these grow about 8 or 9 feet in a full adult narwhal, and it is innervated from its base to its tip. And if you look to the right, that's the magnification of tubules that exist on this tusk, roughly about 9 million over an 8-foot section. So 9 million connections from its inner nerve to its outer environment. These are examples of the tubule on the right, magnified at about 5 to 10,000 magnification. And what we did was slowly put together a picture of how this tooth worked, and it is likely multifunctional, like our teeth are and other teeth of mammals are. So this theory does not negate other prior theories, but rather is a focus on a primary function, which we believe is primarily sensory. One has to think, why would you put all your tooth preserving material into this one giant 9-foot protuberance and sacrifice roughly 12 teeth that the narwhal has at birth but never forms? And these are the faces and the people who made a lot of the research that I've done personally, and we have been able to collaborate with here at the Smithsonian and bring a forum to the rich and deep knowledge that these Inuit elders and hunters bring to research and to biology and to an understanding of an animal that goes much deeper, has a longer experience. These are people that live with this animal. And as scientists and biologists, many of us only spend, at the most a month up there, maybe in the summertime, and very rarely get to see the whale in other environments and other circumstances. Here I am working one of the seasons. This is off Kakiak Point outside Arctic Bay, also in the high Arctic. And Bill had talked a little bit earlier about the seismic testing. Good for this to become a Supreme Court issue that was upheld and has now banned seismic testing in the Arctic. And as Bill had mentioned, also preserving 131,000 square kilometers of ocean in Canada to preserve and help these habitats. So I wanted to take time and see if we can introduce James Simony, who helped with his wife, Natasha Madlik, who's been very close in terms of collaborating with us, as well as the wonderful people of Pond Inlet, who have been so instrumental, along with our collaborators at Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. And hopefully James can set us straight on some of the real facts about how these animals behave, and maybe set some of the science a little bit more straight as well. So I think we're gonna open it up to questions at this point.
Hey, I'm so sorry, Martin, I wasn't able to reach James, so he's not on the call right now.
Yeah, well, if you try him again, let us know. But I can certainly relate some of the information that they have told me. I've been working with them for, at this point, roughly 15 years. So I've absorbed a few things. It's a thick skull here, probably not as thick as the narwhals, but some of the information has entered. So happy to field any questions, and I'm sure Bill on the ethnographic side would do the same. So if there's any others that want to participate in a conversation or dialogue, we're happy to address questions.
We did receive one question in the chat box already, so I'll just relay that to start off. So Nana wants to know how much is known about narwhals living around the Russian Arctic, specifically the population, migration, habits. It says thank you.
Yeah, excuse me, I'll answer that. I guess the first thing to say about it is that very little is known about the Russian narwhals in the Russian Arctic. I have a good colleague, Vladimir Pitulko, who helped me get some information about a professor of his, Makayev, who found a whole mess of narwhals skeletons on a high beach in one of the high Arctic islands in Franz Josef Land, I think it was, Christmas Island, I think it's called. They were all in one place on the beach, and then the geological forces after the Ice Age lifted this area up out of the water. So there were, I think, 8 or 10 of these animals altogether, and they probably died in one of these entrapments where the narwhals get caught in the wintertime in rapidly freezing conditions and can't find breathing holes, and they get caught, maybe landlocked, and can't find breathing holes, and then they all drown. And this has been documented many times. It still occurs today. It's one of probably the biggest danger for narwhals of anything they face, more than human predation or polar bears. It's these entrapments, and this is something that people are worried about because of the future melting. Is that creating more of these situations? Sometimes up to 1,000 animals might die. But anyway, in the Russian Arctic today, there's relatively little narwhal activity because they are associated with the Arctic ice, which melts back north from the Russian coast. So every once in a while, there's a report of a narwhal in around the northern coast and the river mouths of the Russian Arctic. But that's an area where this is the area where in warming conditions, the ice disappears first. And so that ice is being blown across to the Canadian side. And so this is where the main distribution of narwhals is.
I might want to add to Bill's comment that interestingly enough, in some of these areas where the fast ice is forming, several years ago there was one in Pond Inlet, and interestingly enough, the Inuit had seen that it was actually a population from Clyde River, which was obviously several hundred miles south. And the fear was that seismic testing kind of scared that group of whales further north into an environmental condition that maybe caught them off guard. So this has ramifications for the animal and how we interact with the environment. And certainly the Inuit are aware of the different populations within their own communities.
Yeah, there's another thing too. We haven't talked about orcas. There's been some publicity, film strips and things done on the increasing appearance of killer whales or orcas in the north. And they do hunt narwhals when they're up there. And there's been maybe a kind of an emotional response to that, but it's true that orcas have been preying on narwhals for forever. The Inuit have told us that and they know the history. One of the things that they don't consider this a especially bad occurrence, because when the killer whales are active, it often drives the narwhals into shallow bays and places where they're more accessible to Inuit hunters. So, that's their take on the narwhals, as opposed to what a lot of Western people down south think, that this is terrible. But it is something that to watch and to see, how often and whether this is increasing or not. It's, along with the entrapments, this is probably the major source of animals being killed or dying from the big population. But we haven't mentioned the narwhal population has been assigned now to somewhere between 180 and 200,000 animals. So that's kind of a fantastic number. So narwhals are not endangered, but their population may well drop as the ice habitat is reducing.
There's a question that you just answered. Someone asked what the narwhal population was, and that was 180 to 2,000, right?
200,000. Mm-hmm.
I think it's about 180,000.
200,000.
Yeah. It's interesting with the population results. When we started doing this exhibit, the published amounts were roughly 70 to 80,000. In fact, we almost went to the exhibit with that number. And interestingly enough, figures that were redone and recalculated showed quite a substantial difference. I mean, that's quite a bit of a difference. You're talking about 100%, 200% change. And it's always an interesting thing, because the Inuit have always reported that there are more narwhals than the published reports had shown. And many people thought, well, is that a conflict of interest because they're hunting narwhal? They want to show that the subsistence and quotas are all sustainable. But certainly, again, the Inuit have this sense and understanding. They're not out there counting narwhals, but certainly the limitation for doing population studies is pretty dramatic in the Arctic, as you're dealing with very harsh, weather conditions, for example. So planes go overhead and count these whales, as well as counting in general, because counting a whale is not so simple. I mean, narwhals swim in stratified layers, often 4 or 5 levels deep. So if you see 10 whales on the surface, that may mean there's actually 40 to 50 whales actually below that. So scientists actually integrated perceptions from the Inuit understanding this stratified layer and corrected their mathematical models to account for this.
Very cool. We have quite a few questions, so I'll try and keep moving on so we can get to all of them. Karen Pletnikoff wants to know how much the replica tooth costs, and are there any potential sensing technologies to be built from our understanding of the narwhal tooth structure?
Interesting questions. Well, the first one is, actually, I found this just more recently because it's almost impossible to actually find something, let alone something this well done. So I actually brought it to the museum and have been using it for education. But it's from a company called Bone Clones, and they do just incredible stuff, not just for narwhal, but for everything. And because of the new technologies to get these kind of reproduced results, I can tell you both in its feel, the way it's reproduced, because you can't see it close up, it's really a remarkable reproduction. The best I've ever seen, actually. So, but in terms of the second part of the question, for biomimicry applications, narwhal tooth material is actually a fascinating material because it exemplifies the material as identified by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology here in Washington, D.C., which tests just about every material you can know on the planet, and has identified narwhal tusk as the most extreme, flexible, and strong material on the planet. So it has both of these in extreme. Certainly there are materials that are stronger. Certainly there are those that are more flexible. But having both of those qualities in composition is extremely rare. Typically you sacrifice one for the other. So if something is strong, it's not very flexible, and vice versa. The application for a material like that in biomimicry is enormous, because typically there are many situations where in the feature that you're looking for, you really want the other feature to be present. In many applications of something that you want as strength, you also want flexibility. Keep in mind, we make jet airplanes out of composite materials. Who knows what could be made out of narwhal tusk?
So as a dentist, Martin, do you foresee using narwhal products in future dentistry?
It could be. We actually have a group in California cloning the material. We use composites now. The disadvantage of composite materials are they're very moisture and water sensitive. So as a material, we have a hard time adhering that material to natural teeth. It's the interface of two separate materials. But a material like this could offer a completely different possibility.
Expanding on this question, somebody was asking if they can use the tooth for navigation or if it's more just for temperature and surrounding sensing, just more detail about what they're sensing.
Yeah, what we had done was a very isolated stimulus, which was salt concentration in water. We thought it was one of the easier ones to test. The original theory of teeth began from a Swedish investigator, Martin Brandstrom, in the 1950s, who spent about 50 years of his life just solely focused on this topic, and came out with the hydrodynamic theory of teeth, which basically stated that teeth are sensitive to pressure, temperature, and particle gradients. Our teeth indeed have those abilities as well, but the thing that characterizes the narwhal as unique is that it does this all the time. Its switch is on. Our switch is only on if some pathology happens. So if we have receding gums, or naturally if you went to the dentist and had them drilling a cavity, we all know how sensory teeth are. but the narwhal is doing this as a part of its normal function of monitoring its environment. So then the question becomes, well, what's it used for? Because it's primarily on males, our thought is that it's identified with some sex-linked trait. It's either looking for the right female or the right female knows the right male in some way, in some either chemical or interactive way. They get to know each other basically by this tusk.
Martin, one of the other things that I was curious always about the tusk is the faceted ends that often occur. And we've seen in these pictures on the webinar, a lot of polishing on the ends. So, you know, there seems to be some mechanical thing going on here too.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. When I was in this area outside Tremblay Sound in Pond Inlet, one year we were observing the whales coming far into the inlet, and everyone's always speculated as to why. And there's a interesting, it's almost like a volcanic kind of sand at the base of these inlets. And for the first time, I had seen polished tusks almost the full length, bright white. And it's rare, whether it's female or male, to see that. And my thought was, I wonder if they're cleaning this on this sand. What Bill has pointed out is that many of the tusks have a polished end, roughly about 5 or 6 inches in. So obviously there's some abrasive that they are doing on the tip, certainly of this. But based on what I saw in this one experience on the inlet, was that whales may do this over a larger length, but then slowly collect more algae diatoms over their, other seasonal aggregation times. But these inlets offer them the opportunity to perhaps clean or, but I think your point is correct, that they are somehow abrading it against something. I did see. I did see an interesting question about, I saw it come up on the chat thing. Do narwhals sleep? Did that question come up? Was it on your list over there?
Yep, that's what I was just going to ask you.
Oh, okay, good, because I saw it a long time ago and I thought, oh, I hope that didn't disappear. It's an interesting question because there's a hypothesis that with different hemispheres, whales can basically sleep with one hemisphere off while the other hemisphere is still on, basically. So it can trade as opposed to other mammals that, their whole brain kind of goes into a sleep. That naturally, if you're in this marine environment, you need some sense of alertness for your surroundings, but you still want rest and you still want a way to have some downtime. So the question is, well, how do whales do this? So this has been, and I'm not a biologist that's focused on that, but that has come to my attention in the reading.
Martin, something else that is in the exhibit and was breaking news last year was the drone footage. Maybe you could describe that and implications of those new Canadian studies.
Yeah, so this is work that's been done by Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, which has done some great research up in the high Arctic and whom I've collaborated with for many years. The footage that was released basically shows some type of stunning of the fish. How that's done and how it's utilized is still going to be filled in by their researchers, who I'm sure are going to look at this in greater depth. It was presented almost as if the tusk was doing this, but it may be a collaborative thing with narwhal vocalizations doing the stunning and the tusk actually knocking the fish into the mouth, but certainly would defer to them for the complete story. I think it got released in the media probably quicker than their science could kind of catch up to it, but I think that catch up will probably occur in the next year or so.
Yeah, this is just another example of how new technology is really informing our work. People have been going up and watching the animals and talking to the Inuit, but all of a sudden the possibility to see them from above in a drone or even attaching cameras and following their vocalizations, some new work also in that area that's been done by Dr. Laidre and others. So how many people are actually working on narwhal research right now?
It's a handful. I mean, everyone kind of knows everyone because we're all in the same community, and there's only so many places that organized research occurs to even study the narwhal. It's hard to say because many of them do multiple species, of which narwhal is a part. I would say there are at least 10 or so that really focus more of their efforts on narwhal. It's a small group, and there's probably another 20 to 30 that probably do some aspect at some point in their career, but not necessarily delve as a focused area of their research.
And my other question has to do with the some of the programs that are being produced by the environmental groups and then others, you know, about pollution and sound, sonic damage. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that, because you're quite in touch with those, the conservation efforts.
Yeah, this was, I am reminded by people who work more in the sound field, particularly at Cornell University, and the work of Dr. Christopher Clark. You know, these are more powerful sounds in terms of seismic testing than something like a jet engine. It's been quoted as being 100 times stronger. Or if you've ever had one of those foghorn, you know, those horns at a football game, the air horns, it's really like one of those being put on your ear, is the kind of sense that things are happening. And narwhals, keep in mind, see their environment with their ears. Sound is their vision, in a sense. Their eyes are very small proportionally, and their eardrums are enormous proportionally. And their spectrum of sound is enormous as well. There's only a very short spectrum that we can even hear. You know, probably not even 1% do we overlap in terms of the sound world. So this is a very important way for narwhals to understand and navigate, appreciate, hunt, aggregate, socialize. It's in every part of their lives, and we're literally blowing their eardrums out with this seismic testing. So good for the Canadians to recognize this effort, good for the Inuit to champion this. This was mostly done by Jerry Natanin, led this effort with a lot of the hunters from Clyde River, and got the Canadian Supreme Court to agree with them for this ban of seismic testing. So it's a wonderful effort. It shows, again, the Inuit insight and persistence to say, this is an environment we need to protect, and this is an animal that's extremely and most highly revered, especially for the communities that hunt this whale, that have revered it in its mythology and understanding. So it's been a very critical point for them, and I think it's a great effort that was completed.
Something else I'd like to mention, we've been talking mostly about Canada, and we sort of focused on Pond Inlet and a few of the villages in northern Canada, but narwhals are equally available in West Greenland and also in Northeast Greenland. There's a very large population there, and probably some of these populations go back and forth. And there are quite a lot of Danish science that's related to this, and I know you've done some work over there too. So we don't want to miss the fact that there's a strong Danish and Greenlander, Inuit Greenlander component, you know, of interest, of science, and so forth.
Absolutely. Two groups, Dr. Heide Jorgensen and Kristen Ladra, both have been doing long and well established and great research up in Greenland, combined with a whole consort of Canadian researchers that have equally done wonderful work. We mentioned Marianne Marcoux, who was one of the curators with the exhibit, also Steve Ferguson, Randall Reeves. There's a whole Bevian list of people that have, Pierre Richard, who have really offered pieces of a puzzle, because naturally this animal is so elusive, so difficult to study, that really every piece of a puzzle to understand it is valuable. And with the collaboration and cooperation of all of these pieces, we can form things like this wonderful exhibit here at the Smithsonian that tries to bring as many of these pieces together and show the public really the kind of efforts that are being done.
Jessica, do we have any more questions or? Jessica?
Everybody's muted out here.
Jessica's been flying across the Atlantic and maybe she's
I see almost everybody on mute, so I don't know. I know we were going till 2. I don't know if you wanted to say some closing words, Bill. And
well, I'll be happy.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
there's Jessica. There's one final question, and it was directed towards Martin, asking what the most difficult moments you experienced during some of your expeditions in the Arctic were.
oh boy, I can think of a lot of difficulties. One comes to my mind immediately. We were in the town of Repulse Bay doing research, and it is in many ways a demonstration of all the things that could possibly go wrong in an Arctic field season. It began with a horrific accident. We had just met with the Hunters and Trappers organization, and moments later, I would say hours later, there was a domestic dispute. His then girlfriend shot him in the back of the head. He was murdered in a gruesome way. And this was the first day we arrived. So we had Canadian Mounted Police descended on this community. These are small communities too. In this one, there was only several hundred people. It just rattled everybody. And we thought we just almost would have to get on a plane and go back. Then we went out, and for 13 years, narwhals consistently came to this place. And this year that we had gone, no narwhals were seen. So you can imagine preparing yourself for a full year, doing your research, and then the whales don't show up. So that's an obstacle. Then, to add to this, during the camp, we had been stalked by 2 or 3 polar bears. And polar bears are very smart animals, and they don't take kindly to people who don't understand that this is their kingdom, not yours. So, and there's different ways of handling polar bears, but the Inuit have a very different way of handling polar bears than the people I was with on these expeditions. Mainly, the Inuit wait and do everything possible not to shoot a warning shot or anything, whereas other people I was with would shoot warning shots, but that for a polar bear means you can scare me now, but there'll be a time later that's not going to work. So we were stalked, and 2 polar bears came into our camp and were traipsing on tents. We had some difficulties. Then at the end of this field season, there was an Arctic hurricane. We had 120-mile-an-hour sustained winds for 3 days. And I can tell you, in the Arctic, nobody is coming to rescue you. There's no plane coming, there's no boat coming, and no one's really waiting to find out what's going on with you. So you're isolated. We had tents rip. We had Zodiacs with engines flip over. I mean, it was just chaos, and it was at a full moon too. So imagine an Arctic hurricane, full moon. You had every condition that you could possibly not want, and there were 4 of us that were huddled in this wooden hut, and that was the first time I had that vision of the Wizard of Oz with everyone floating up in the house, and just lucky that we made it through. And that's your Arctic field season. You come home and you go, okay, how do I report now to the National Science Foundation of how I spent your money in the last 3 weeks? And this is a story that every Arctic researcher has. There's some strange version of this in another way that happens. It can be weather, it can be people, it can be the whale. These are all unpredictable, and that's again why these pieces of a puzzle are so valuable.
Nevertheless, we keep going back. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of people out there listening who maybe aren't familiar with the Arctic and wonder why do people spend their summers with, jackets and gloves and hats and big boots and cold and wet and whatever. And but there is something special about the Arctic that is delightful. It inspires us, and I think one of the reasons we're doing this exhibit is to try to impart some of that experience to people who only see this stuff on television, and to make sure that there's a lot of science and thought that goes into it. So unless there are other questions, I just want to thank everybody for participating, and keep your eyes on the north. There's fortunately a lot of our media is covering northern stories of all sorts these days, about the Inuit, about the animals, about the climate, and so forth. It's a part of the world that we knew relatively little about and still don't know enough. And as Martin has pointed out so carefully, the much of what we are learning now is not coming from our own instruments. It's coming from talking to the Inuit and getting to know those people and having them as partners in our projects. We've certainly experienced that with this exhibition project. So I want to thank all of you, and thank you, Martin, for being a wonderful co-curator with me on this project. Our exhibit team, and Jessica and Meredith and all those folks too. So if there's any more to be said, Meredith or Jessica, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you guys can hear me, but can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear.
Oh, good. I was gone for a while. We'll post the recording of this webinar on the IARPIC website probably on Monday, so keep your eyes out and share it with anybody who'll be interested. And I also thank Martin and Bill for this great webinar. It was really fascinating.
Yep, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.